Studies and chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, Duke University. I also want to note that we're joined by Charlotta Barringer Brown, who is the Dean of Humanities, Social Science, and Business at Southside Virginia Community College. Charlotta is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. Charlotta will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and answering questions. So let us proceed. Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African and African American Studies, Professor of English, and Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University, where he teaches courses in Black popular culture, including signature courses on the history of Black humor, Black masculinity, and the Motown and American culture. Neal is the author of 6 books, including the just published Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive 2022, What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Popular Culture 1999, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture, The Post-Soul Aesthetic 2002, and Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities 2013, and co-editor with Murray Foreman of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, now in its 2nd edition. Neal has been featured in several documentaries, including PBS's Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, Netflix, The Two Killings of Sam Cooke, and A&E's Right to Offend, The Black Comedy Revolution, and even portrayed himself in an episode of the BET scripted drama Being Mary Jane, which starred Gabrielle Union. At Duke, Neal directs the Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship, which produces original digital content, including the weekly video podcast Left of Black, now in its 13th season, produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke. A native of the Bronx, New York, Neal received his PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo, his MA and BA from the State University of New York at Fredonia. Dr. Neal, it is an honor and a privilege to be here with you tonight. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I got to say, you got a natural radio voice there. I felt like I was growing up in New York listening to Ricky Crocker on WBLS. so thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I do encourage all the listeners out there that if you have any specific questions, feel free to email me at man9@duke.edu. And also feel free to follow me on social media, specifically Twitter at New Black Man. I'm honored to be here tonight to spend some time with you to talk about this culture that has played such an important part in American history, American society, and has been so critical to the experiences of Black Americans at the same time. And I wanted to start with this photo, really to give folks an indication of how closely the Black activists of the 1960s were connected to what was happening musically at the time. The picture that you see here, the photo you see here, is an impromptu song session at a SNCC fundraiser at the home of Theodore Bickel. And you see these group of folks holding hands and singing, and when you take a closer look, you realize there's some extraordinary figures who are in this photo. The great Lorraine Hansberry, who of course is known as the playwright of A Raisin in the Sun, the legendary vocalist Nina Simone, who many might argue was in fact the voice of the civil rights movement, former D.C. mayor when he was just an activist himself, Marion Barry Jr., the legendary John Lewis, who passed away a few years ago, and of course, really the person, the engine who made so much of this happen, the great Ella Jo Baker, who was really instrumental in the creation of SNCC. She served as an early mentor for the group. She was the one who really created the connective tissue between the Student Coordinating Committee and the SLP, which is the organization, of course, that Martin Luther King was a part of. In this next clip, and this is the Freedom Singers, all right, the group of folks who performed very often as fundraisers and as forms of inspiration during the civil rights marches in the 1960s. And here they are performing in this clip at the White House. It'd be interesting To listen to the clip and the songs and the story behind this particular song that they're going to sing that's really well known. But there are also other parts of this particular performance that I want to talk about after you watch a little bit of it to give you some indication of why this music is so significant. The primary singer that you heard there was the great Dr. Bernice Reagan Johnson. Next to her was her daughter, Toshi Reagan, herself an amazing singer and folk singer in her own right. But what's so significant about this clip, as they're singing these songs that hark back to this era of protest, is that this is not music that was intended to entertain. This was not music to simply listen to. The music of the civil rights movement in and of itself was a participatory culture. You had to engage, you had to be involved. These were songs that they sang, obviously, when they were at work, when they were marching, when they were planning, when they were organizing. And the way that they sought to bring everyone into the fold was to create music that was accessible to many people, that had the kind of rhythmic nature to it that everybody could be drawn into, that had the kind of thematic subject matter that folks could grapple onto and kind of anthem-like situation. So this was a really important part of bringing folks into understanding the power of this music. There's perhaps no greater example of how important the music was to the movement than the relationship of the music and some of the musicians to the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, we're going to spend a few times here before we actually get to 1968 to kind of set up the context for 1968. We know, for instance, that things didn't just explode in 1968. This was a long, ongoing process. Whether we're talking about the folks who were organizing at the Highlander School in the 40s and the early 50s, like Ella Jo Baker, whether we're talking about the Brown versus the Board of Education, and obviously what happens in Montgomery, in 1955 and the bus boycott, this is an ongoing process. And while 1968 also marks the death, obviously, of Martin Luther King, his assassination of April of 1968, I thought it would be useful to see the ways in which Martin Luther King utilize music, and particularly gospel music, in the context of this struggle. This clip is him preaching in Chicago when he went to organize there in 1966, and he's joined by, one of the great folks living in Chicago at the time, the great Mahalia Jackson. I love watching that clip and the smile that you see on Martin Luther King's face. You don't often get to see him smile in photos and some of the footage, and so it clearly is a joyous moment here. And it's important to remember who Mahalia Jackson was. You know, we all remember Aretha Franklin as the Queen of Soul, but the reason why she was called the Queen of Soul, why her queenness was qualified with the idea that she was singing soul, is because there were other queens. There was the great Mahalia Jackson, right, who was the queen of gospel. You also had, folks, other blues singers like Dinah Washington, who was the queen of the blues. And both Mahalia Jackson and Dinah Washington were important influences on Aretha Franklin. We also know from some of the stories that we hear about the civil rights movement, and particularly in the case of Martin Luther King, some of which was dramatized in the film Selma, the role that she played is almost like his personal Spotify account. Those times where he was feeling really deep and dark about what was happening in terms of the civil rights movement, it was not unusual for him to give her a phone call, for her to share a few of her talents, to sing to him, right, to soothe him and give him inspiration. And this is one of the great examples this clip shows of how that relationship played out. As such, it was apropos that one of the voices that were called upon Martin Luther King's death was, in fact, Mahalia Jackson, and we'll see this, her singing at his funeral in this next clip. Given the importance of the black church in the organizing of the civil rights movement as a safe space for activists to be able to organize and do other things, gospel music and the civil rights movement really did go hand in hand. Gospel music was the natural musical accompaniment to the civil rights movement. But there were other artists, obviously, who were inspired and working within different musical genres. One example was the great pianist Dr. Billy Taylor, who wrote an instrumental song called "I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free." A few years after he did that instrumental version of the song, the great Nina Simone added lyrics to it, and that's what we're listening to now. Yeah, y'all almost lost me there. I was kind of zoned out listening to Nina Simone sing that great song. I mentioned that in many ways she was the vocalist, the soundtrack of her music, the soundtrack of the civil rights movement. She was among a group of black celebrities who contributed to the movement in very different ways, whether it was performing at fundraisers or writing checks. And by these men and women that I'm talking about, the Harry Belafontes and the Sidney Poitiers, I mentioned Lorraine Hansberry earlier, Sammy Davis Jr., Ozzie Davis, and Ruby Dee, and of course, the great Nina Simone. And Nina Simone was specifically brought into the movement by Lorraine Hansberry, who was her great friend. When Lorraine Hansberry passes in 1965, part of Nina Simone's tribute to her was writing a song that we now know as the anthem "Young, Gifted, and Black," which takes on a life of its own, by 1969 and 1970. But Nina Simone also wrote a song that is really one of the most powerful black protest songs ever. I would argue, with the exception of "Strange Fruit," which is actually written by a white Jewish school teacher in New York. But the vocalist that we think about singing that song, of course, is Billie Holiday, the first version of which was done in 1939. But Nina Simone wrote a song called "Mississippi Goddamn," which is every bit as powerful and was dangerous for her and her career as "Strange Fruit" was for Billie Holiday. And as Nina Simone told the story in her autobiography, her memoir, I Put a Spell on You, she talked about, writing the song shortly after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham in September 15th, 1963, and how her first impulse that, she was mad at white people. And as she had a story, her husband, who at one time had been a police officer, he was running around the house asking her husband, where his guns were, because she wanted to go out and shoot some white people. And her husband kind of calmed her down and told her, Nina, that's not your way, right? Your way, you're an artist. We want you to be able to share your art in a way that's very palpable. So we don't want you shooting people, in that context. And that song, of course, that she had sat down and wrote very shortly is a song called "Mississippi Goddamn." Mississippi Goddamn was such a powerful song, and to really understand how impactful it was, you have to go back to the fact that Nina Simone was essentially a torch singer. She sang torch songs. She was one of the few black artists at the time who had access to the kind of upscale supper clubs like the Copacabana and other places like that. And she was willing to sacrifice so much of that to be able to share her passion for the civil rights movement, in the context of the music that she recorded. her ability to be able to have a successful mainstream commercial career was significantly damaged, for many years after the recording of Mississippi Goddam. It's very difficult to hear the record beyond the Mason-Dixon line, obviously, and things of that nature. But she was a very popular artist at the time that showed how important it was to make these kind of sacrifices for the civil rights movement. As was the case with the jazz Max Roach, who was a young drummer during the bebop era, who by the time we get to the 1960s had matured to become a great artist in his own right. And he sat down and he recorded an album that was released in 1962 called We Insist, Max Roach's Freedom Now Suite. And as you can see from the cover art of the album, they replicated the sit-ins of February 1, 1960, right? They were making very clear how important that social movement was for them as artists, and that they were going to use their music to be able to contribute to what was happening in the civil rights movement. The clip that you're going to see now is this group performing with the primary vocalist, who was Max Roach's wife at the time, the great singer and actress, the late Abbey Lincoln. In many ways, Abbey Lincoln's voice captured the kind of rays bubbling below the surface, particularly for young black folks in America in the early 1960s. I should also note the look of Abbey Lincoln. Abbey Lincoln was one of the first black celebrities in the 1960s to begin to sport an Afro hairdo. It was an attempt on her part to try to reconnect African Americans to a broader West African heritage. It was not unusual to see her in that era with a full afro or braids, and also wearing certain kinds of African garb. And again, they were one example of what was happening in jazz music. And as was the case for John Coltrane, who many people think of as kind of the musical version of in what he brought to jazz music in terms of his style of playing and improvisation, that he was to jazz music in the 1960s what Malcolm X was to black politics. And he too was impacted by the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And in response to that, he wrote one of his more beautiful ballads, a really stirring and striking ballad called Alabama. Oh, oh. That was John Coltrane's great quartet, Jimmy Garrison on bass, the great Elvin Jones on drums, and McCoy Tyner, who just recently passed away, on piano. And while jazz was very much a serious music during the 1960s, the young folks in the era were also attuned to what was happening in the civil rights movement. And no one group, I think, captured this sensibility amongst young folks in this era of protest than Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. And part of their success as a pop group that crossed over to mainstream white audiences was the fact that they were so well versed in the black gospel impulse. And in many ways, they were at the forefront of introducing the black gospel impulse in a way that, Aretha Franklin would certainly do so a few years later, and Sam Cooke would do in the era of the Impressions, but introducing white America to the impulse of black gospel music at a time when black gospel music was so important to the civil rights movement. This track here is one great example. This is one of the first major big-time hits for the Impressions, a song called Amen.
Good evening, everyone. We are still here. We're just working through a few audio issues here with the sound. but we are here, and Dr. Neal is here. And as I mentioned earlier, I
I,
appreciate the
I
energy.
realized I had muted myself. I'm sorry.
It is all good, sir. And listen. Looking at the chat, everybody is having a good time with the music and
That's good.
hearing from you. And it is all good. Thank you so much. We'll continue on.
Thank you. So as I said twice now without anyone hearing me, the reason why the Curtis Mayfield and Impressions version of Amen resonated so much for audiences because the year before it was recorded, it was featured in a film that starred Sidney Poitier called Lilies of the Field. It was the first. It was a film that earned Sidney Poitier his first Oscar win, and it featured him as kind of a wandering worker who helps a group of nuns build a chapel. I want to show this clip one because it's interesting because he teaches the nuns how to sing Amen. And in many ways, what the black singers were doing during the 1960s were teaching white audiences how to engage and participate in black culture and in the civil rights movement by extension. And I have a few other words to say about this clip afterwards, but if we could watch the clip now with Sidney Poitier singing with the nuns. So Sidney Poitier couldn't sing. And so the voice that you hear is actually the man who arranged that version of the song Amen, which of course we know is kind of a traditional song. But this particular arrangement was done by a gentleman by the name of Jester Hairston, who's also singing the vocals in this particular clip. Those of you who don't know who Jester Harrison was, he was a great singer. He was kind of a character actor. I think many of you, if you ever watched the television series in the 1990s, late 1980s, Amen, Jester Harrison played the character of Raleigh, right? Jester Harrison himself lived to around 99 years old. And we're going to get back to Mr. Harrison in a second. But this is one of the reasons why this song and this performance in the film Lilies of the Field, the songs and the music of the Curtis Mayfield and Impressions begin to resonate amongst audiences. And what's interesting about the group is hearing the way that their message shifts over a kind of period of time. So where Amen is kind of a secular gospel song, if you will, by the time they record the next year on the same album, in fact, this song called Keep On, you feel a little bit more urgency and even militancy in their music. 'Cause I got my strength. Don't make sense. Keep on pushing. Keep on pushing. And another good example, this song released in 1965, again, the kind of urgency and insistence on Black people really becoming more engaged in the civil rights movement. This is from 1965, The Impressions and People Get Ready. And this is music that would begin to have an international impact. The Impressions, in particular, and their style of harmony, influenced another trio that lived in the country of a trio of Bunny Wailer, Peter Tosh, and of course the great Robert Nesta Marley, Bob Marley, who began to sing in a kind of harmonic structure as the Wailers that was very much influenced by the Impressions. And when you think about great Bob Marley music, I Shot the Sheriff is kind of the song that introduced him to white audiences in the United States. But if you ask any nominal person, what song they know of Bob Marley, inevitably they will mention the song One Love, right? And when you go and you listen to One Love and you look at it as it's laid out on a record jacket, One Love is actually a mashup of One Love and Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, People Get Ready, right? So again, this is music that would have influence not just the United States, but also globally. But I also wanted to show this clip, right? It's not a musical clip, and it's a clip of Sidney Poitier in the film In the Heat of the Night. And to think about what the Impressions are singing in 1964, what Sidney Poitier's role is in a film like Lilies in the Field in 1963, and what that now looks like in 1967 as the energies and the push towards civil rights has begun to change. There are more militant voices, whether it be the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee becoming much more militant, or the figures of the Black Panther Party, which emerged in 1966. You start to see some of this reflected in films like In the Heat of the Night. And I want to show this clip, and it's probably the most well-known clip in any Sidney Poitier film. And I'll give you some context of this after we watch the clip. So I'll start with the end of that clip. The gentleman holding the lemonade was, in fact, the great Jesse Hairston, and the kind of look of shame that he gives to his boss at the end of that clip. Other kind of small things that the kind of things I pay attention to because I'm a professor. Um, as he's explaining to him why they had come to investigate him, the sound of the rooster in back, as if it was kind of the physical embodiment of Malcolm X's claim of the chickens coming home to roost. And then the interesting kind of way that Sidney Poitier does the slap and kind of holds his shoulder and then fixes his shoulder, fixes his jacket before he leaves. But the significance about this scene, of course, is that for many folks watching this in the theater, right, there's no VHS, there's no streaming services, you can't rewind. When you saw this the first time in the movie theater, you weren't going to see this scene again until you paid $2 again to go watch the movie again. It resonated in that kind of way, at almost being reflective of the shift that was taking place in the culture. There, of course, were other figures who were important to this shift, some of which most folks were unaware of. So for a period between 1963 to 1964, Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, Jim Brown, and Malcolm X had a very close relationship. Part of it was dramatized in the Regina King film, A Night in Miami, about the gathering they had after Muhammad Ali wins the heavyweight championship in 1964, excuse me. And also it's been dramatized in an MGM series now called Godfather in Harlem, which really kind of revolves around Malcolm X's relationship with Bumpy Johnson, who was a gangster in Harlem, and Congressman Adam Clayton Powell. But I wanted to bring Sam Cooke into this mix because he also becomes one of these important voices in this moment. The photos that you're seeing here are this part of this relationship with him and Ali. In fact, Ali went into the studio and made a couple of records that Sam Cooke produced, and that was part of the context for their relationship. But Sam Cooke was a very well-known pop singer, right? He was one of the first black pop singers, soul singers, really to cross over to white audiences with his very first single, You Send Me. But he was also a very astute businessman. And at a time when many artists didn't have control of their publishing or didn't have control of their master recordings, Sam Cooke was one of the few, Ray Charles being another, who had the wherewithal to understand the business of the recording industry and try to take control over his career. There are many who speculate part of the reason why he was killed was because he was pursuing a sort of control not only of his career, but other black artists who were, in his universe. But Sam Cooke was also someone who was attentive to the civil rights movement, obviously through his relationship with Malcolm X and these other men. And he watched very curiously as a young folk singer recorded a song that in the early days of the civil rights movement became one of the early anthems. Sam Cooke loved Dylan and loved Dylan's version of Blowing in the Wind, so much so that he recorded his own version of it, albeit with a little swing. as folks close to Sam Cooke would attest to, as much as he loved Dylan and much as he loved this song, he was frankly embarrassed that it was a white singer who created the song with the depth of a blowing in the wind that articulated what was going on with the civil rights movement. And it was with that embarrassment on his mind that he sat down and he wrote what he felt was going to be his own civil rights anthem. One of his mentors, the great R&B soul singer Bobby Womack, recalled Sam Cooke playing the song for him, and Bobby Womack said, his response to Sam Cooke is like, "Sam, this sounds like death." Of course, Sam Cooke would not live to see the song have the kind of impact that it would have. He certainly didn't live long enough to see the election of a Barack Obama, and it was virtually impossible to be around in October, November, December of 2008 and not hear this Sam Cooke song being played all the time. No, change gonna come. One of the groups that I have not talked a great deal about, of course, is the Motown label, Berry Gordy's Operation, which was the most successful black record label in the 1960s, and probably the most well-known black musical brand. Berry Gordy famously called his label the sound of young America, and he very consciously attempted to record music that would not have a lot of political content. When we think about the group that is, really was the flagship group of Motown Records, it's Diana Ross and the Supremes, and there's this clip here of them singing "Stop in the Name of Love," which we could watch very quickly, performing at the Hollywood Palace. The Supremes were built for crossover appeal. All the acts at Motown had to go through etiquette classes so that they knew how to carry themselves when they were out in public. The Supremes famously wore gowns that were designed by the great designer Bob Mackie. So this was all intentional, right? And it's not that it wasn't important. The Supremes as an act, for instance, had 6 straight #1 records, in the mid 1960s, which was unprecedented for a black act at that time, and unprecedented for female acts at that particular time. So there was something important about what they were doing, but we often don't think about Berry Gordy as being someone who was particularly political. Yet in June of 1963, in Detroit, was hosted a march that was called the Great March to Freedom, featured Dr. Martin Luther King. And in fact, you get a preview of the I Have a Dream speech that gets delivered in August of that year at the Great March to Freedom in Detroit in 1963. And Berry Gordy had the wherewithal to record that speech, to document the speech in June of 1963. And the photo that you see on the right is a photo of Berry Gordy presenting a copy of the album, actually a few days after the March on Washington. Next to Martin Luther King is Lena Horne and the great Dr. Billy Taylor next to them. And it spoke, one, to the fact that folks understood what was happening in the time, and even if the music couldn't be political, there was ways that they could contribute to that. Detroit, of course, was also the hometown of the great Aretha Franklin, and most notably her father, Reverend C.L. Franklin. And this is a photo of Martin Luther King and Aretha Franklin together at a conference, 1967, and this is actually a photo next to that of Martin Luther King. Standing directly next to him on the right is Reverend C.L. Franklin, and this is them, in fact, marching for March to Freedom in 1903 in Detroit. And Aretha Franklin also resonates as a very powerful voice in this particular moment. And even though her music at the time wasn't necessarily political, she would become political later. When you listen to her album, Young, Gifted, and Black, when you hear stories about the fact that she attempted to provide the bail money for Angela Davis when Angela Davis was incarcerated for a period of time, she had a political sensibility, but it wasn't necessarily contained in her music. Or so we thought. And I love this quote from the great writer Shirley Ann Williams. As she explains, Aretha was right on time, but there was something about the way Aretha characterized respect. We just knew that this sister wasn't playing around about getting respect and keeping it. And this, of course, is in reference to her great single in 1967, It Breaks Her Open, Respect. The powerful moment, of course, in the song is when Aretha actually spells out respect. And for many Black audiences, Black folks, what they heard was something more than her singing about this man that was disrespectful. The history of song, of course, is that it was a song that was originally recorded and, in fact, written by the great Otis Redding. And Aretha does her cover version of it. And as Otis Redding famously said at the time, that girl done stole my song, but she's a friend, right? So it was all good for him. But you start to hear in the sound of the music a change. And no one really heard the change of that sound. The man that we call the godfather of soul, James Brown. And if there is a sonic revolution that occurs, it occurred in 1967 on a song called Cold Sweat, which I would like to describe as ground zero for the funk revolution. So what was so revolutionary about this song, and you go back and listen to it and think about the introduction to the song, right? And there's almost no introduction. The song starts bop, ba, and when we hear James Brown talk about this concept of on the one, this idea of the accented first beat, most traditional rhythm structures in Western music were the 2 and the 4, right? Everybody understood that. And what he did was to accent this beat, right? He had been doing it in the previous song. This is really the song where it all came together. And what that accented first beat does is to give it a kind of swing. It's a swing that we now understand as funk music, right? And we can't even imagine so much of American music without that kind of funk accent on the one. What we hear as a downbeat, which is actually kind of an upbeat in that context. And he begins to build a sonic universe around this sound that gets picked up on by so many artists, Sly and the Family Stone, the work that Norman Whitfield is doing at Motown. And this quote really is really useful, to putting it in context, what was happening in 1968 in the context from April 4th when Martin Luther King is killed until October of 68 when James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud becomes at the top of the charts. And this is from a piece that I had sent that I had written, that Black music has long been thought to be a balm for Black trauma in the United States, to the point that there is a certain expectation that what Black musicians choose to produce should easily map onto the political realities of the time. It's part of the reason folk keep hoping and wishing for truly transformative hip-hop artists to fix suit to power in this moment, often lowering the bar for those artists who seem to come close enough. The generation of Black folks living and surviving in 1968 were not any less woke than the so-called woke generation of, say, 2018, but they also weren't necessarily waiting for James Brown or Aretha Franklin to save the day. And I wanted to pull up, this chart from March 2nd of 1968, just to give you a kind of sense of the diversity of music that's out there in this month before Martin Luther King's death. At the top of the charts, of course, is I Wish It Would Rain by the Temptations, but you have also other kinds of classic songs that are in there that would become significant to our understanding. Dionne Warwick's theme from the Valley of the Dolls, et cetera, et cetera. When we go to early 1968, in fact, March 9th of 1968, it brings us back to the Impressions. Except it's not the impressions of People Get Ready. It's not the impressions of Say Amen. It's a much more radical and militant sound that's coming from Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions, where they're now talking about, no, forget all of that. We're winners in this moment. And this is such a great song. And I got a little backstory about it also. No, it doesn't matter. It is tight too. And of course, you hear him talking about we're moving on up, a theme that would resonate a decade later on a television show called The Jeffersons, right? Which is really about the generation who survived and achieved, right, in the civil rights era. But the thing about this song and the kind of music that Curtis Mayfield had made before this part of time, radio loved them. Crossover radio loved them. But when they recorded We're a Winner, this was one of the last crossover songs for the group The Impressions. Radio stations protested by not playing the song, and not just white radio stations. There are many black radio stations that felt that the song was too militant. Part of the reason why Curtis Mayfield eventually goes out on his own to start a solo career, right, is because some of the tensions in the group where Curtis Mayfield wanted to be political, and the other guys, while they appreciate the politics, right, they also wanted to make sure they had a regular paycheck and could sing the kind of songs that they had been successful singing before. This is a song that's at the top of the charts a month before the murder of Martin Luther King. The 2 weeks towards the end of March, there's another song that tops the chart for 2 weeks. It's Sitting at the Dock of Bay by Otis Redding. Otis Redding dies in an airplane crash December 8th, 1967. He had started working on Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. It wasn't quite finished, and the song gets finished and released in January of 1968. And of course, it's kind of a tribute recording to Otis Redding. It's a song that is unlike anything else in his catalog. And in many ways, the song is prescient. Otis Redding recorded for the Stax recording label. The Stax recording label was one of the biggest and most vital Black businesses in the city of Memphis. At the time that the song was at the top of the charts, Martin Luther King was in Memphis, right, organizing on behalf of the sanitation workers, right? So there was something almost about this recording, and particularly this recording that almost feels eerie-like, right? Someone who is looking past a future beyond life, right, almost to the afterlife, as Otis Redding sings the song Sitting at the Dock of the Bay. Those of you who are familiar with the song, the whistle solo at the end is just simply iconic, right? And it captures this kind of wistfulness that normally we don't think about in terms of Otis Redding's music. And the fact that he had passed on made that particular performance even more eerie and prescient in that context. The artist who really takes control of the R&B soul charts in 1968 in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination is James Brown, right? And it's not the James Brown song that we would think. It's a song called I Got the Feeling, right, which is actually one of his most successful pop songs early in his career. And I wanted to read this quote from Albert Goldman of the New York Times, writing about James Brown in 1968 and trying to put him in some sort of context, particularly in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's murder. Famously, James Brown, the night of the assassination, the next night, he was scheduled to perform in Boston. And there were folks, obviously riots all throughout the cities of the United States, including Boston, where he was. And he was supposed to give a concert. And folks were really hesitant, to have the concert, to have people come out. And James Brown basically performed a free concert for anyone who could come to the concert that night, but also worked with the leadership in the city of Boston to televise the concert so that people could watch James Brown on television and not be out in the streets. It spoke on one level to the power of who James Brown was at that moment, even though James Brown was somebody who wasn't necessarily political in the ways that some of the other artists was. And writing about James Brown in June of 1968, Albert Goldman writes, to whites, James is still an offbeat, a scream at the end of the radio dial. To blacks, he's a boss. The one man in America who can stop a race ride in its tracks and send the people home to watch television. The song, of course, is I Got the Feeling, and we can hear this real quick. Some folks might remember this song being performed 20 years later on an episode of The Cosby Show, where the ensemble cast performed the song for the grandparents that were featured in the series. Other music that resonated during that summer was dance music, right? And one good example of this dance music is a group called Archie Bell and the Drells that had a song called Tighten Up. And if we could hear a quick clip of that. 1968 is because of lots of protests and riots and what was happening in that particular era. But there were also many sports protests of note. The iconic photo of John Carlos and Tommy Smith with the Black Power fist and the black glove in their hand, which occurred in Mexico City in 1968 in October that year. Same protest by the sprinter Lee Evans, who also won a gold medal for the 400-yard dash. But there was also a protest that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and it was by Wyoming, and why can't I remember her last name? But she was a sprinter. She was the first woman sprinter to double up in the sprints, and she does her own form of protest at the beginning of her race for the championship in 1968. You take that gesture from Wyoming Titus in 1968, and you go forward to 2012 when another black woman Olympian, Serena Williams, wins a gold medal at the Olympics, right? And she does a version of the Crip Walk, right? Another kind of style and dance that was deeply connected to black youth culture at the time. So again, these are kind of gestures that spoke to a certain kind of politics in the moment, even when they were not broadcast in the way that we would immediately think of them as politics. And of course, the summer of 1968 was the summer of Aretha Franklin. This is her cover of Time magazine in June of 1968, again, 2 months after the death of Martin Luther King. She records this great string of singles during that year, Chain of Fools, which is at the top of the charts for 4 weeks in the early year. She does a song like, if you could play the middle song for me. And then she also tops the charts for 5 weeks that year with the song Think, which is from an album that was recorded and released in 1968, Aretha Now. I recognize all of these songs in a certain kind of way because they spoke to how diverse Black people process what was happening in the civil rights movement in that particular moment in terms of their listening practices. Much of this is generated from these music charts. And music charts, this is an era before there's any technology like SoundScan. Much of the recording of the charts are coming directly from Black radio stations and Black record stores, right? These kind of things that don't even exist anymore in this particular moment. So they are really an interesting kind of reflection of what was happening in Black communities based on what folks were requesting hearing on the radio and what folks are buying in record stores. The three songs that dominated what we think of as the long, hot summer of 1968, from July 13th to December 28th, are three specific artists. One is the South African trumpeter Hugh Masekela and his song Grazing in the Grass. Hugh Masekela, of course, is a South African trumpeter who's also dealing with his own form of political protest in the context of South African apartheid. I think many Black audiences resonated, connected with this song, right, because of kind of romantic notions of the African continent and ideas of freedom that are embodied in this whole idea of grazing in the grass. Another one of the songs that also dominates for 4 or 5 weeks during the summer is by a group called the Dells. And the Dells were most well known as kind of a doo-wop group that began in the 1950s. And a few years earlier, they had recorded a song called Oh, What a Night. But they did it in a very different kind of style that was more doo-wop style. And so when they redo this song in 1968, it again reflects the kind of shifting ideals of Blackness that are occurring in the culture. This is the Dells. The version of Stay that they recorded in 1965, it's about 2.5 minutes long, and it's kind of a mid-tempo ballad. This version of it, they slow it down. It's twice as long. Again, it reflects a different kind of ethos in the culture at the time. And then the song that actually was number one for the longest period of time in 1968, prior to the ascension of James Brown's I Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, was in fact Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell's ballad, You're All I Need to Get By. Morning, dude. this would be some of the last live studio recordings that Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell would do together. She would suffer from a brain tumor that she would eventually succumb to in 1970, and it pushes Marvin Gaye in a totally different direction. Most of us, if we know of Marvin Gaye's music, we know of the great album he does in 1971, which is really a byproduct of everything that's happening in the culture at this period of time. James Brown, of course, was soul brother number one, as he was known to so many folks in the culture at the time. And throughout the summer of 1968, as things were getting more heated, he was also getting pressure from many factors in Black culture, notably the Black Panther. And after a series of sit-downs with the Black Panther Party, who were encouraging James Brown to be more political, right? If he was going to be soul brother number one, if he had this platform as an artist, why not use that platform in a way that was more deliberate in terms of impacting what was happening? And it was after the shooting death by cops of two Black Panther Party members in early August of 1968, James Brown went into the studio, right? And that's kind of an interesting dynamic, James Brown going into the studio, because he was always in the studio. He was always on the road. They would do three shows one night, and then he would find some studio to go in to work out something that he was hearing in his head. And this really was at the peak of James Brown in terms of his creative energies. And so he just sits down, he decides he's going to do this song. He wanted some children's voices. And where they were in Los Angeles, there weren't a whole lot of Black kids. So actually the children's voices that you hear on the recorded version of Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud are basically white and Asian children who are singing Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. I wanted to play this particular clip of his performing this song because it gives you a sense of where he was in the culture. In the 1960s, there was a late night program called Playboy After Dark. It was something that Hugh Hefner did. It was kind of a variety show. And he was one of the folks who was really open to bringing Black acts onto Playboy After Dark. And this is a performance of James Brown performing Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud to an audience that looks nothing like the people that he's singing about in the song. There were even critiques of James Brown at the time, that he wasn't wearing this a quote here that was quoted in a Black newspaper. If James Brown is so soulful, why does he still have that conch in his hair process, which is what he often wore early in the 1960s and obviously his beginning in the 1950s. But in this clip, you see that he has his own version of a kind of modified afro. But this song was number one on the charts for 6 weeks. And I think in many ways captured the shift that was taking place in terms of Black politics. I don't think we see a song like this written and released without the kind of tension that took place early in the year. King's assassination, the reason why he was in Memphis in the first place for the assassination in terms of supporting Black laborers, sanitation workers, Obviously, the murder of Robert Kennedy in June of 1968, right? Everything that was happening in Vietnam, and the fact that the FBI was engaged in an all-out assault on black militant groups, most notably the Black Panther Party, right? By the end of 1969, of course, we've witnessed the murder of Fred Hampton. Throughout 1968, Bobby Seale is under arrest for the protests at the Chicago Democratic Convention, which was another kind of a platform for police brutalities and young protesters, black and white. And so James Brown had the kind of voice that could bring the music together. Ironically, the song that has stayed most popular after that is a Marvin Gaye song called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which is number one for 7 weeks from the end of December to the beginning of January. And what I'd like to think about in terms of what's happening politically with this song, it's not a political song, but this idea of I Heard It Through the Grapevine, right? It was a song that was originally recorded by Gladys Knight and the Pips on Motown. It's a kind of upbeat dance song. But when Norman Whitfield produces Marvin Gaye's version of it, it has a different kind of sound, almost a kind of sinister sound. And when I hear this from these ears from 2023, and I hear it through the grapevine, I hear music that resonated in the context of a surveillance culture at the time in which so many black organizations, whether it's the Black Panther Party or the mainstream civil rights movement, had been infiltrated by various different forces as a way of surveillance in terms of what was happening and what we now know as COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that was led by J. Edgar Hoover, that had a significant impact on destabilizing black protest organizations in 1968. That's it for me. And thank you for those of you who stayed with me now for almost 2 hours. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed what we talked about. I hope you learned something. I hope you found something valuable that you can pass on to your students.
Dr. Neal, I have to just tell you from the depths of my soul and spirit, thank you so much for this evening. And I will tell you, the time flew by fast. It's like, being at a family gathering, a cookout, or just a get together or reunion. And I can see it in the chat. If you can see the audience chat now, it's just a constant stream of just thank yous. And I could encapsulate it as Alexander, who said along the way, great vibes. Carrie, who said, can we have part 2? This is the best webinar ever. Several people asked for a playlist. And then last, one that I could directly relate to, Douglas Barrow, who said, my mom came in and said, turn it up. I had the same experience as my mother popped in and was listening when she heard Mahalia Jackson. So I tell you, this has truly been an experience, and we appreciate your time, your commitment, your honesty, your relatability, and just helping us to understand how the music of this period, how Black music in general reflects our emotions of grief, rage, resignation, suspicion, and defiance. And so it's truly been an enjoyable evening. Again, I ask you all to just continue to follow the events and happenings at the National Humanities Center through our various social media outlets. which includes Instagram, Mastodon, as well as Facebook. Not so much Twitter right now, but please continue to follow us. And we also have our next webinar, which will be coming up soon, January 31st, New Orleans History, America's Future, Katrina, COVID-19, and the Climate Crisis. We have Andy Horowitz from the University of Connecticut, who will be with us on that night. So again, just stay tuned. And again, Dr. Neal, it has truly been an enjoyable evening, and we look forward to connecting with you again down the road.